So picture this. It's 1917, and America is a sleeping giant. Its army is tiny, the public is deeply divided, and it is just completely unprepared for the sheer brutality of World War I over in Europe. So how on earth did it transform, seemingly overnight, into a global military powerhouse? Well, let's dive into the incredible story of how America went all in.
All right, we're going to break this down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at the massive challenge they were up against. Then, how they built a war machine from practically nothing. After that, how they sold a really controversial war to their own people. We'll also see the huge social changes that nobody saw coming. And finally, we'll talk about the steep price of that unity.
So, let's start with that first big piece, the challenge itself. You have to understand, the U.S. government didn't just have to join a war, it had to pretty much invent a modern war machine, almost from scratch.
I mean, this was the central question, right? How do you do it? And mobilization wasn't just about getting soldiers and guns. No, this was about reprogramming an entire nation, its factories, its farms, its finances, and maybe most importantly, its people, all for a single purpose: total war. So where do you even begin with a task that huge? Well, you start with the engine of the country, its economy. And this meant a massive, unprecedented expansion of federal power, which led to this whole flood of new government agencies designed to direct basically everything from what factories were making to how the war was funded. And this is where we get the famous alphabet soup of new federal bodies. You know, agencies like the War Industries Board, the Food Administration, and the Fuel Administration. Suddenly, these groups had immense power to manage the entire national effort. And what's fascinating is how they went about it. The War Industries Board took a really direct approach, basically telling factories what they needed to produce for the military. But the Food and Fuel Administrations, they took a much softer approach. They appealed directly to the public with these huge campaigns for things like meatless days and victory gardens. And in doing so, they cleverly turned a personal sacrifice into a powerful act of patriotism. Of course, a war on this scale costs money, a truly mind-boggling amount of money for the time. To get this massive undertaking off the ground, the U.S. government had to raise over $33 billion, a figure that was just almost unimaginable back then.
So where did all that cash come from? Well, not just from taxes. In what was really a stroke of genius, the government went straight to the American people. Through these huge, emotional Liberty Bond campaigns, they basically transformed a financial transaction into a public test of your patriotism. Buying a bond wasn't just an investment, it was a public declaration of your loyalty.
But, mobilizing factories and finding the money was only half the battle. The government was now staring down an even bigger challenge: mobilizing the American mind. They had to convince a deeply divided population to actually support this war.
And this is where the Committee on Public Information, or CPI, comes in. Let's be real. This was America's first Ministry of Propaganda. It was led by a journalist named George Creel, and its one and only mission was to sell the war to the American people. Plain and simple.
The CPI used this incredibly powerful two-pronged attack. On one hand, you had pure inspiration. Think of those iconic Uncle Sam Wants You posters and huge patriotic rallies. But on the other hand, you had pure demonization. They just unleashed this flood of atrocity propaganda in posters and films like The Kaiser, the Beast of Berlin, painting the German enemy as inhuman monsters. But posters and films could only do so much. The CPI needed a way to get its message out to everyone, everywhere, face to face. And to do this, they built a volunteer army, a massive one, 75,000 strong. And their method was absolutely brilliant.
They were called the 4-Minute Men. This huge network of volunteers would use the 4-minute break it took to change film reels in movie theaters to stand up and deliver a powerful, pre-approved patriotic speech. It was a genius tactic that reached hundreds of millions of people in an age before radio and TV really took hold.
But all of this total mobilization had consequences that no one really intended. It didn't just reshape the economy, it fundamentally rewired American society. And this created incredible new opportunities for some people and explosive new tensions for everyone. 1 million. That is the estimated number of women who entered the American workforce for the very first time. I mean, with so many men off to war, women stepped up. Millions more moved from traditional roles into higher-paying industrial jobs that had always been closed to them.
And all this visibility was a total game changer. By proving just how capable they were in factories and shipyards, women's contribution to the war effort became completely undeniable. This gave them the final powerful argument they needed to push the 19th Amendment, the one giving women the right to vote, right over the finish line.
At the exact same time, another equally massive shift was happening. As many as 500,000 African Americans began a truly historic journey, leaving the rural South behind for the industrial cities of the North.
This was the dawn of what we now call the Great Migration. And it was really driven by two powerful forces: the economic pull of all these new job openings in northern factories, and the desperate push to escape the violence and oppression of the Jim Crow South.
Okay, but this forced national unity, it came at a very, very steep price. In its quest to silence anyone who disagreed with the war, the federal government passed laws that basically took a sledgehammer to civil liberties, targeting one of America's most cherished ideas, freedom of speech.
And you can just see how quickly things escalated. In 1917, you get the Espionage Act, which made it a crime to interfere with the draft. But just 1 year later, the Sedition Act went so much further, making it illegal to even use disloyal language about the government or the military. With restrictions that broad, a Supreme Court showdown was pretty much inevitable.
And believe me, these laws had real teeth. Over 1,000 people were convicted. The most famous case was the socialist leader Eugene V. Debs. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for the simple act of giving an anti-war speech.
So when these laws finally reached the Supreme Court in a case called Schenck v. United States, the court actually sided with the government. And in doing so, it created this powerful new legal test, arguing that speech isn't absolute. It can be restricted if it creates a clear and present danger to the nation. Those 4 words would echo through American law for the next 100 years.
And so this whole period leaves us with a really profound question, one that is just as urgent today as it was a century ago. When a nation is in crisis, what's the right balance between national security and individual liberty? How far is too far? Where do you draw the line?